that way, betrayed instead of delivered. So now we know the end of the story, right? We know what ends up happening. Judas, of course, does go on to betray Jesus. So Jesus is not just again talking about his suffering and his death that is coming, but this time it seems he's referencing the fact that he's going to be betrayed into the hands of men. And perhaps the reason we see in verse 32 that the disciples couldn't understand what he was saying is because they probably could not imagine that maybe they thought it was one of them. Are we really going to betray you, Jesus? I mean, that was probably incomprehensible to them. Maybe that's why they didn't want to ask him. Boy, if I ask Jesus what he's talking about and he says, yeah, you're actually the one that's going to betray me. I mean, maybe they were afraid because they were afraid they would find out that it was them. But I mean, this, Jesus says here, he talks about this being delivered over, being betrayed. He's going to be betrayed by somebody who knows him, somebody close to him. That's kind of what is at the heart of betrayal. And so then, just like in chapter 8, we see that the disciples responded to what Jesus was saying. And again, it wasn't exactly a good response. So in verse 33, it says, they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. So they're still struggling, right? They're still struggling to understand just what it's going to mean for Jesus to be the Messiah who dies, the Messiah who suffers. Those aren't two things that they're able to connect together quite yet. And so they're also struggling for what does that mean for them as his followers. And so in the midst of the God of the universe talking about suffering and death, they were concerned about who was the greatest and kind of seemed ashamed to even admit that to Jesus. Now there's evidence of these types of discussions among Jewish groups at that time, that was kind of a common discussion. So you've probably heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls before. These are a large group of scrolls that were found in the Qumran caves near the Dead Sea. And and these scrolls are some of the oldest and most complete manuscripts we have of the Old Testament. But they were manuscripts that were collected and preserved by a group of people known as the Essenes. And so there's evidence that this community of Essenes at Qumran, that there's evidence that they would annually rank each individual in their community according to the worthiness of each person. All right, we have evidence of this. Now, with baseball season coming upon us, it's, kind of used to rankings when it comes to that. You can hop online and find all kinds of rankings for which baseball players are the best, all the way down to who they consider the worst, which are still better than me. But, we see rankings there. Can you imagine if churches were to rank each member in a similar fashion? I mean, awkward, right? Awkward, but yet also totally missing the point. But there's evidence that was kind of a common thing. So, so the disciples, it seems like they're falling into that kind of thing here, like Jesus, if we're going to rank 1 through 12, the disciples, okay, Judas is probably 12, right? But so who's number 1? I mean, so you kind of see them falling back into this common way of thinking. But at the same time, what Jesus goes on to show is maybe that's a common way of thinking, but that way of thinking has no place among his followers. I mean, look what he says in verse 35. So after he asks, he knew what they were doing, but so he says in verse 35, and he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me. So, since Jesus took a little child in his arms to make a point, I thought that'd be a fun opportunity for me to do the same thing this morning. So, if it worked for Jesus, I thought, hey, I can try it too. So, and I get the bonus of getting to hold my sweet Melanie for just a little bit. So, So we're going to bring Melanie up here and snack in hand. I like it. That's right. Oh, I don't want to mess up snack time, do we? That's right. So in seeking to help the disciples understand, it's a lot of people, isn't it? I can tell. You're just like, whoa. So Jesus wants to help his disciples understand what he's saying here. He taught them that if you're going to be first, then you have to be last. You have to be servant of all. And so he seeks to drive home that point by holding a little child. You're just frozen. It's okay. It's okay. Now, often when Jesus talked about little children, he talks about things like having faith like a child or being obedient like a child. In this instance, he's saying something completely different than that. We'll actually get into that next week a little bit. But here, Jesus is talking about something different. He's urging his followers to have not the attitude of a child, but he's calling them to have the attitude required to receive a little child. And the scene here suggests that it is a little child. It is an infant or a toddler. We're not talking a high school student or even an elementary school student that's kind of becoming a little more independent, doing some more things for themselves. Jesus is referring to a child who is unable to provide for themselves, unable to defend themselves. And it doesn't take a parent of an infant long to either learn for the first time or to remember again the incredible humility and sacrifice that is required to receive a little child into your life. I mean, the endless, I love you, right? But the endless cycle, right, of crying, feeding, changing, bathing, rocking, and it's endless. It's not exactly a glamorous life, right? It's physically draining. It's emotionally draining. It's mentally draining. It's humbling. It's dirty. It's repetitive. And in order to care for that child and do it well, it requires a person to both humble him or herself and sacrifice their own wants and desires over and over again. Even Melanie, you're growing up, right? She's over 1.5 years old now, so she's growing, she's doing some more things for herself, but she still requires a good bit of humility and a good bit of sacrifice to care for her. In fact, your favorite word lately is more, right? Can you say more? Can you say more? No, okay, but it is. More, right? More food, more somersaults, more holding her high in the air, more books, right? Not the same book, that would be, or not a different book, because that would be one thing, but the same book, more, over and over and over again, right? And it's, and you've maybe heard me say this before, all right? Maybe heard me say this before. I was actually talking with Todd Garber about this last week, but man, I became a selfish person when I had children. And the truth is, I'm not any more selfish now than I was before, probably. But having a child and understanding the humility and sacrifice required sure reveals my selfishness within me. Right? To receive a young child is to take a position of humility, of sacrifice. And that's exactly what Jesus is calling his disciples to do. When he picks up that young child, he says, you have to receive a child. And when you receive a child, you've received me. And when you receive me, you've received the one who sent me. You've received the Father. And it's not just with children. He's just making a point with the child. That's every area of life, right? It's that type of humility, sacrifice, selflessness, in every area of life. The disciples wanted to know who was the greatest. They were arguing about who was the greatest. Jesus picked up a little child and says, it's the one who serves in the manner that's required to receive a little child into your life. What a powerful statement Jesus is making there, calling his disciples to follow him in that manner, to have that type of humility and selflessness and sacrifice in your life. You want to go back to mommy? You're not going to say a word, are you? That's okay. We'll give you back to mommy now. Good job. Hopefully I don't scar her for life with that. But so as followers of Jesus, the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we displaying that kind of humility and sacrifice in our life? Because that's what we're called to. Do I look first to my own wants and my own needs, or do I yield to that of others? Do I make decisions based upon my own desires or that of others? Do I fight for my own preferences, or do I allow others to have theirs? Do I serve out of my own comfort, or am I willing to sacrifice for others? I mean, it's those kinds of questions that I think Jesus is leading us to ask. According to the Roman thought, and even how the Jews thought the Messiah would act, greatness came through power. Greatness came through control of all. And Jesus flipped that squarely on its head. And he said, no, greatness comes through being last. And greatness comes through being a servant of all. The ones who received Jesus and became truly great in his kingdom would be the ones who were willing to humble themselves and sacrifice in the same way that it would be required to receive a little child into their life. It's a powerful, challenging statement that Jesus is making to his disciples here. Well, then after this scene, Jesus goes on, and there's some more teaching that takes place in the rest of chapter 9, the first part of chapter 10. We'll actually double back next week and cover a couple of those teachings. But then in chapter 10, verse 32, for the third time, Jesus proclaims his upcoming death and resurrection. So chapter 10, verse 32, you can follow along with me there. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." Now, man, right at the beginning of that, I find it interesting that Jesus is walking at the front of the pack as they make their way to Jerusalem. You'd think the person who is going to suffer and be crucified would be dragging behind, right? Maybe slowing down the procession a little bit. We get a picture here of Jesus not reluctantly going to the cross, but with commitment, with determination. He is out in front, leading the group to Jerusalem. The ones who followed behind were the ones who were afraid. Jesus was out in front. He possessed a resolve that I think only came from his faith and trust in the Heavenly Father. I think that's why he could walk in front of this group as he was walking, as they were journeying to Jerusalem. Not even the crucifixion that awaited him could destroy that faith that Jesus had in his Heavenly Father. And so as he's confidently moving ahead, Jesus for the third time spoke clearly and openly about what awaited him in Jerusalem. And we kind of get another new detail. He talks about this time that the Jewish leaders would be the ones who would condemn him to death, and then the Gentiles would be the ones who would actually perform the deed. And I think in that we get this analogy of how all of mankind is guilty. Both Jews and Gentiles were responsible for what took place on the cross. And so what's going to play out among a specific group of Jews and a specific group of Gentiles in Jerusalem is true of all Jews and all Gentiles throughout all history. All people are stained by sin, and there's not a person who doesn't play a role in what took place on the cross. And before we move into the disciples' response again, Jesus ended his statement just like he's ended the other two. I want to make sure to point this out, because each time Jesus makes this proclamation about his suffering, about his death, he always ended it in the exact same way. Chapter 8, chapter 9, here in chapter 10. Each time he said that after 3 days, he will rise. So he's talking about his suffering, he's talking about his death, but he's also making sure to point out that he will rise again. And that is crucial, because that is the proof that this way of the Messiah is valid, that this way would be victorious over the typical way of the world, which was, exert your power, exert your control, make yourself great. His resurrection is the stamp that says, yes, this way of the Messiah is the victorious way. For his whole life, Jesus had lived that way of humility, that way of sacrifice. His journey to the cross is no different. It's in the midst of this ultimate display of humility and sacrifice that we will see the true victory that is going to come. And so we can't forget that. We can't forget that the way of the Messiah is the way of victory, because it doesn't always seem like that. When we are humbly serving someone else, and when we are putting others before ourselves, it doesn't always feel like that is the victorious road to travel. But the resurrection verifies that it is, that is the way of victory. So we have faith in the one who raised Jesus from the dead, that there is a real victory that comes from walking this way of the Messiah. So back to the disciples, right? You'd think that they would start to be grasping it by this point. Twice now Jesus has talked about his death and resurrection. Twice they've responded. Twice they've kind of been reprimanded by Jesus, and he's gone on to explain some things. And so it seems like they're starting to understand the victory aspect, but look at what happens here in verse 35. It says, "And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, 'Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you.'" They're coming with great humility there, right? Boy. "And he said to them, 'What do you want me to do for you?' And they said to him, 'Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory.' Jesus said to them, 'You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?' And they said to him, 'We are able.' And Jesus said, 'The cup that I drink you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared.' And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John." So you got James and John asking this question here. They clearly expect that Jesus' glory is going to be revealed, and so in response to that, they say, "Hey, well, we'd like to have some positions of authority. Jesus, can we sit at your right? Can we sit at your left?" Those were positions of authority, positions of influence, positions of power. And so they apparently felt comfortable enough to ask Jesus that, "Hey, will you grant this request for us?" And so Jesus responds by asking them a question. Can you truly drink the cup I'm going to drink? Can you be baptized with the baptism that I'm going to endure? And James and John, man, it doesn't even seem like they miss a beat. Yeah, Jesus, we can do that. And it just seems clear. They don't really know what Jesus is getting at here. It seems they thought Jesus was asking if they were worthy to sit in those places of authority. In reality, what Jesus is asking is if they are able to follow him in the path that he is going to walk. And even though James and John probably misunderstood what Jesus was asking them, they did answer correctly. They couldn't have known this at this point, but James would be the first of the disciples to be martyred. So he was going to drink the cup and be baptized in the same way. John was just put into a cauldron of boiling oil and then exiled to an island for decades, potentially. So to a degree, they did drink the cup, and they were baptized as Jesus was. I don't think it happened how they thought it would at that moment, but regardless, they were going to walk in that. But it's even ironic in this whole interaction that we see the humility of Jesus put in contrast to the pride of these two disciples. Right? James and John come full of pride. They come to Jesus wanting these positions of authority and of power. And Jesus, in response, shows humility by deferring to the authority of the Father. He says, "They're not even mine to grant anyway." So you got the disciples, grasping for power, and Jesus, God himself, deferring to his heavenly Father, saying, no, these aren't even mine to grant to you. So it's this interesting contrast that we see there. And James and John, we can't even just point our finger at those two, because then the other 10 disciples hear about it, and they're indignant. Why are the other 10 disciples indignant with James and John? They want those positions too, right? I mean, all 12 are at fault here. Now, the other 10 were maybe too scared or too slow to ask for those positions, but it's clear they want them too. That's why they're indignant with James and John. So all 12 disciples have yet to grasp this way of the Messiah. And so Jesus went on and he gave them more teaching about what this way was. Verse 42. Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So Jesus, he calls out the practice of the Gentiles, of the Romans. They consider greatness to be displayed when one ruled with control and coercion and power. I mean, everything about Rome screamed this way of thinking. Their army was mighty. The buildings were impressive. Roman Caesar was domineering in how he ruled. Everything about Rome pointed to that way of thinking. But Jesus explicitly stated that his disciples should not live in that manner. Instead, he echoed what we just talked about earlier, right? That the greatest is the one who serves. The first is the one who places all others above himself or herself. And then to top it all off, Jesus went on to talk about how his own life would be the ultimate display of this way. He's talking about even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. So even Jesus himself, God in the flesh did not come to earth to be served, but to serve. And it's one thing for you and I to humble ourselves and sacrifice ourselves. It's a whole other thing for the God of the universe to do that. For Jesus himself to take that position. If there's anybody that could have ruled with power and coercion and made himself great, Jesus is the one. I think God is fully capable of doing that, but yet came and chose to walk this different way, walk the victorious way of the humble Messiah, the sacrificial Messiah, the selfless Messiah. And the degree in which he did it is right here, right? This is a full humility, a full sacrifice. He completely gave of himself when he hung upon the cross. So elders, you guys can come forward as we get ready for communion. Again, what we have on the table here is it's both an act of unconditional love, but it's also a reminder of what we're called to. So, as we talked earlier about the humility and sacrifice required to receive a young child, in some ways it's almost easier to humble and sacrifice ourselves for our young children. They have some moments where they're pretty cute and they're our own flesh and blood, and it's one thing to sacrifice ourselves for, like for my dear sweet Melanie. It can sure be a challenge to treat others in that way when they're full-grown adults and they bother us and they've greatly wronged us. Man, that can be a challenge to receive somebody with that humility and with that kind of selflessness. And the table symbolizes for us that act, that is what Jesus did. Right? Romans 5 reminds us that when Jesus died on the cross, it was for us while we were still sinners. We had wronged him greatly. We were living in rebellion of him, and because he still, received us with that humility and sacrifice, what gratitude ought we to have to him this morning? mean, we ought to come to the table this morning with great gratitude. You think about the humility and the sacrifice that was shown as Jesus hung on the cross to pay the penalty for my sins. He chose to humbly serve me rather than exert his control over me. If you've not opened yourself up to that love of Jesus, I encourage you to consider it. I'll caution you, it can be uncomfortable to be loved in that way, and it can be uncomfortable to be served in that way. We can come up with all kinds of reasons why we don't deserve to be treated that way. And we'd be right. We would totally be right. But to be loved and served that way changes our life. I mean, we are given new life through Jesus, what he did on the cross, and that new life lasts for all eternity, never to be taken from us. And so I guess if you hear nothing else that I say this morning, know that Jesus loved you enough to completely humble himself and completely sacrifice himself for you and for me upon the cross. The table this morning is a display of that act of Jesus walking that path. And so we come to the table with gratitude because of that act, but we also ought to be reminded as we come to the table of what Jesus calls us to and how we are to follow him. You know, what we have before us is an example that we are to follow. We are to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. Now, when we walk that path, it may not lead to literal martyrdom on a cross. It's probably not going to. But it will lead to daily sacrifice. It will lead to daily humility in our relationships with God and with people. And so I so wish there were some switch that I could flip or easy prayer I could pray where I would just instantly respond to people with humility and sacrifice in every interaction that I have throughout the day. I wish it were that easy. But there isn't a switch like that. It requires me to consistently keep Jesus and his work on the cross in the front of my mind. It requires me to consistently lay myself down and allow God's Spirit to lead me and to guide me. There's consistent repentance and asking for forgiveness that I have to have when I fail to walk in this way of the Messiah. And so as we eat, as we drink this morning, allow the sacrifice of Jesus to be the lens through which we view our daily interactions. So the next time someone approaches us in anger, remember the sacrifice of Jesus. And the next time someone comes to us with a desperate need, we remember the sacrifice of Jesus. And the next time it's been a long day and your child wants your unconditional attention, remember the sacrifice of Jesus. I say that one for myself especially. Jesus' sacrifice is both the gift and the way. It is both. It is the gift that brings us from death to life, but it's also the way in which we are to walk. It's the way of the Messiah, the path of the Messiah. And as followers of Jesus, we're called to walk that in our daily lives.